Hello everyone and welcome to episode 1 of MamdaniWatch, the only regular YouTube series that will be chronicling the mayorship of Zohran Mamdani as it unfolds. I am your host, Electionism. I am a lifelong New Yorker. I have lived in New York for my entire life. I have the green New York City school student metro card to prove it. And I was also a volunteer on the Zohran Mamdani campaign. Just to get this out of the way, to be clear, I am speaking for only myself. I am not speaking for the Zohran Mamdani campaign. All political opinions here are my own. So in this episode, in the very first episode, all I really wanted to do is take a look at the results of the 2025 New York City mayoral election and kind of explain how Zohran finally got the win and is now the mayor-elect of New York City. I really just wanted to talk about the election results and what they can tell us. I know that there is some stuff out about his transition team, and believe me, we will get to that the next time I upload. But for now, I just want to stick to, sort of appreciating Zohran's win and also looking at the areas where he could potentially improve in the future. So, first thing right out of the bat that we can see, Zohran Mamdani won 1,036,051 votes. That's 50.5% of the vote. And while that isn't the highest percentage of votes ever received by a mayoral candidate, that is the most votes ever received by a mayoral candidate in terms of sheer volume. So, big W here for Zohran Mamdani, a huge mandate to lead. 50.5% of the vote was also more than a lot of people were expecting on the campaign. I know that a lot of pollsters who I had looked at were talking about, Zohran maybe winning somewhere between, the mid to high 40s range, not even cracking 50. So the fact that he cracked 50% of the vote is huge. Now, there is a caveat to this map that I'm looking at. This is with, I believe, around 93% of the vote in, so some votes could still roll in, but I don't think it will be enough to change any of the sort of fundamental demographics of where he won and where he didn't win. So, huge victory here for Zohran Mamdani. It is very clear that he is going to be the mayor-elect of New York City, and that on top of that, he has a massive mandate of a majority of New Yorkers who voted, and he has a majority of New Yorkers behind him, supporting him in his quest to make the city more affordable. Another shocking thing when you look at this map, aside from Zohran's 50.5% victory, which is huge, is the fact that Curtis Sliwa really underperformed here. When you look at the areas where Curtis Sliwa was expected to win, expected to do well, very Republican sort of connected areas like South Staten Island, like Rockaway, like Broad Channel, like some of these areas in northeastern Queens, you really expected Curtis Sliwa to win some of these neighborhoods. And you can even see here with the New York Times neighborhood by neighborhood breakdown, Curtis Sliwa didn't even win any neighborhoods at all. He doesn't even have a color on the map. So that is something that is really shocking and should sort of concern a great deal of people who were potentially on his campaign. And it's something that he has to learn and has to adjust to if he plans ever to run for office again. Honestly, I think Sliwa would be a great Staten Island borough president. I think that's where he should remain. However, of course, he has to wait another 4 years to get an opportunity at that. So that's the second surprise of the evening, that Sliwa did not win any neighborhoods or precincts, although he did come in second in a lot of them. If you check a lot of these sort of darker precincts out here, sort of by the Sheepshead Bay area, as well as in Rockaway, you can see that Curtis Sliwa comes in second in a lot of them and Zohran third. So he did clearly get some votes at the very least. So now let's get into the map. Where did Zohran do well and where does he need to work on? So first, you can see right here, there is the Commie Corridor neighborhood of New York. That's sort of this continuity here along the East River that stretches all the way up here from Astoria into Greenpoint and Williamsburg through Bed-Stuy and Bushwick and down into the sort of Prospect Park, Red Hook, and Sunset Park neighborhoods. This area is known as the Commie Corridor because it elects a lot of progressives all of the time to basically every office. This area is the area that produced AOC and Nydia Velázquez, who are two very progressive members of the House of Representatives, representing New York's 7th and New York's 14th districts, respectively. And this area also produces a ton of very progressive state legislators. This area produced Jabari Breezeport. This area produced Claire Valdez. This area produced Julia Salazar. So a lot of very, very progressive state legislators who are sort of leading the progressive charge come from this area, and this is a area that was largely expected to go for Zohran. Honestly, if Zohran didn't win in this area, I think that he would be in trouble, and if he didn't win any of these neighborhoods, here sort of along the East River, then Cuomo probably would have won the election, and it would be very, very bad news for Zohran Mamdani in this election as the results rolled in. So very glad to see he won those areas. It also shows that Zohran was able to retain interest. These areas are sort of his base. And the fact that he was able to recall all of those voters from the primary and tell them, no, we're not done yet. We still have more work to do. You have to vote for me in the general is always a very good sign that he was able to actually maintain the interest in his candidacy into the general election. So very, very important and very, very integral to his victory that he won in these sort of base areas from Astoria down to Sunset Park. Other areas that Zohran Mamdani did well in that are sort of notable include many of New York City's South Asian enclaves. These include Jackson Heights over here, and while it doesn't really show up on this map, it shows up better on the New York Times neighborhood by neighborhood breakdown. You can see Zohran Mamdani had a very, very strong showing in Jackson Heights. He also had a very strong showing in areas like Richmond Hill and Jamaica, which, although they're not as South Asian as Jackson Heights, still have very, very large South Asian populations. And it really goes to show that South Asians are now a political force in New York City politics. They are now an ethnic group that any future politician will have to deal with and will have to appeal to, just like any other. And we will definitely see, even post Zohran, a lot of elected officials are going to have to actively catering to and, seeking the endorsements of leaders in the South Asian community in New York City. So very exciting to see that, especially after a lot of South Asians, or at least more South Asians than you would think, voted for Trump in the 2024 election. Zohran Mamdani was kind of able to bring them back into the fold, not only because he focused on affordability, but also, of course, because he himself is a South Asian Muslim man. So these are very, very good looks for the South Asian community and for their political participation in democratic politics in the future. We can also see that Zohran Mamdani did surprisingly well, although not too well, in a lot of these areas in eastern Brooklyn, eastern Queens, and the Bronx. You can see that Zohran Mamdani won majorities in the Brownsville neighborhood, the East New York neighborhood, the Cypress Hills neighborhood, as well as the St. Albans neighborhood, the Queens Village neighborhood, and some of these neighborhoods in the South Bronx as well. So it is very, very good that he won those areas. There was kind of an open question about whether or not he would actually perform well in these areas in the general election. There were a lot of questions about that since Zohran Mamdani did not notably win these areas in the primary. Brownsville went to Cuomo during the primary. East New York went to Cuomo during the primary. Canarsie went for Cuomo. A lot of these areas in the South Bronx, like Melrose, Mott Haven, Morrisania, Hunts Point, many of those areas went for Cuomo during the primary election. So the fact that these areas did not go for Cuomo in the general is a very encouraging sign and shows that Zohran is expanding his base to include a lot of these working class Black and Hispanic neighborhoods that he kind of underperformed in the primary. So very, very good to see that. There are a few reasons why this could be and, sort of why voters have decided to switch to Zohran Mamdani. A part of that is that these areas are very heavily institutionally connected to the Democratic Party. They always elect Democrats, and Zohran having the D next to his name instead of, in a primary where everyone is competing to have the D next to their name probably helped him a lot. A lot of representatives of these areas, such as Farrah Lewis, who represents sort of this area of Brooklyn over here, and Khalil Anderson, who represents this area of Queens over here, and Al Taylor, who represents this sort of portion of the Bronx and Upper Manhattan, that probably also helped him a lot to gain the trust of a lot of these communities as well. At first, a lot of people were worried that Zohran would be sort of seen as this kind of gentrifier candidate, as someone who only represents the areas of, Bushwick and Bed-Stuy, which are heavily gentrifying slowly as the years go on. And although these are majority renter areas, these are progressive areas, they also tend to be a little bit younger and whiter than some of the other areas in the city. So the fact that Zohran was sort of heavily banking on those areas to win the primary probably caused some people in these sort of outer neighborhoods to be a little bit suspicious of him, and then those people's votes were probably brought back by the fact that a lot of their representatives actually wound up endorsing Zohran in the general. Another thing that could be potentially causing this sort of Zohran sweep in the South Bronx, as well as in eastern Brooklyn and eastern Queens, could be the fact that Zohran has focused very, very heavily on appealing to younger people, and in these areas, typically you have a much older primary electorate. You have a lot of old people turning out in the primary. In these areas, a lot of older people are more associated with the Democratic Party than younger people, and potentially Zohran was able to turn out a lot of independents in his favor in some of these areas. Once again, I don't necessarily have data to back that up yet, but a lot of younger people in these areas might be sort of more independent than their older counterparts. They might be sort of more disillusioned with politics, and so may not have been registered with a party when the time came to select the Democratic Democratic nominee for mayor. And when the general election came, many of these younger people potentially might have turned out for Zohran Mamdani. So younger people may have helped him win these areas. Once again, can't confirm that, just a theory, but that's also something to keep track of. Another thing to keep track of is how well Zohran did in the upper area of Manhattan. He did win these areas in the primary, but he also won them in the general as well, and it's very good to see his very impressive showing there. This sort of goes with a pattern that Zohran has been continuing of strong support among the Hispanic New Yorker community in areas such as Washington Heights and Hamilton Heights, as well as in other majority Hispanic areas such as the sort of Parkchester area over here, as well as some of these majority Hispanic areas sort of on the periphery of Bushwick, and in East New York and Brownsville as well, where there are also significant but not necessarily a majority Hispanic population. So very good to see that Zohran Mamdani has kept up his support with the Hispanic community as compared to the primary. There were some concerns about this, especially because Zohran is a socialist, and some Hispanic voters come from places like Cuba or Colombia or Nicaragua, where their experiences with socialism aren't necessarily the best in all cases. So it is good to see that Zohran has kept his trust with the general Hispanic electorate as well as with the primary Hispanic electorate. So that's good to see. Of course, I think Zohran winning at Upper Manhattan was not just due to Hispanic voters. I think it was also because of the fact that Columbia University is located in this area, which also probably helped him a lot. So there also is that. And of course, it's also very good to see him performing very well in Harlem. That was sort of an area that was a toss-up, but ultimately went to Zohran during the primary. So his good performance there shows that he is in good standing with the majority working class population of that district, and I am glad to see him perform well there. So those are kind of the areas that Zohran won over. Those are the areas that Zohran was able to win over, these sort of areas of the Bronx, as well as these areas of northern Manhattan and eastern Queens and eastern Brooklyn. So it's very, very good to see that he's been able to not just rely on his primary electorate to come out again, but also convince people who maybe voted against him in the primary to actually turn out for him in the general. So very impressive stuff here to see. But also, I do think it is important to look at the areas in which Zohran performed poorly to see what might provide a challenge for him in the future. And the first area I want to start with is this area up here in northeastern Queens, because I believe it is the most significant. Now, some areas here were kind of expected. This area of Whitestone up here is represented in the city council by Vicky Palladino, who is a very MAGA, very conservative councilwoman. So I'm not at all surprised that this area went to Vicky Palladino. That's not a surprise to me at all. We also see that this area over here, sort of by Maspeth and Glendale, went to Andrew Cuomo. Not surprised by that at all either. Because this area is represented by Bob Holden in the city council, who is the most conservative Democrat ever. He's endorsed by the Republican Party of that area. He's retiring this year, actually, but the fact that this community elects him is why it's not a shock that this area went to Andrew Cuomo. However, what does shock me and what concerns me a little bit more is how well Andrew Cuomo performed in the Flushing area, as well as the Fresh Meadows area and the Kew Gardens Hills area. That scares me. Now, Zohran Mamdani won these areas in the primary. He won Flushing. He won some of these areas out here, like Fresh Meadows and Kew Gardens Hills. Although Kew Gardens Hills may have gone to Cuomo, I'm not sure about that. But the fact that Zohran won Flushing in the primary and now lost it in the general is very, very, very surprising to me, and kind of a little bit disturbing, if I'm being honest. The fact that Zohran did not win in Flushing should be a red flag. Zohran Mamdani had all the right endorsements from this area. He had John Liu, who's a very influential state senator from this area who does a lot to represent the Chinese American community in New York City, which, of course, Flushing is very famous for its very large Chinatown and its majority of Asian voters. So the fact that despite the endorsements of some of the big wigs in this community that Zohran did not do well should be a sign that something about his messaging is not hitting this area particularly well. So Zohran needs to keep an eye on that. He needs to be very careful with how he manages his relations with that community going forward, and he really needs to work with that community on a much higher level than he has been. I think there are a few reasons why he could have lost this area. Number one is education reform. This area cares a lot about educational reform. This area cares a lot about, making sure New York City public schools are top-notch and making sure that their children get the best education. The issue is that Zohran Mamdani has in the past, toyed with the idea of abolishing the specialized high school system, which is a system, if you're not from New York, where there are 9 high schools located throughout the city. They're all elite, and you test into them. There has been accusations that the system is sort of racially rigged and biased against Black and Hispanic New York high school students, and as a result, Zohran Mamdani wanted to abolish it early in his political career. He went back on that promise in exchange for the John Liu endorsement, which I mentioned earlier, but the fact that he was even toying with that idea may have turned off a lot of voters in this area. Another thing that might have turned off voters is the fact that Zohran wants to abolish the gifted and talented program for kindergartners, which might not seem like a big deal, and indeed it really isn't a big deal. He doesn't want to abolish the program altogether, even just for the kindergartner demographic. I think that may have scared off a lot of voters from that part of Queens. So that is also another possibility. The last thing that I think may have sort of turned off some voters in this area is the fact that Flushing tends to be a very NIMBY area. A lot of people in this area are worried about the ramifications of upzoning and building more affordable housing. A lot of people are worried that this will either give developers sort of an unlimited license to gentrify that area and push out the majority Asian population, or that potentially affordable housing will bring crime and poverty to the area, which a lot of these voters are worried about. So those 3 reasons may have been why Zohran did not win here, and he really has to get his numbers up here next time if he wants to stay the mayor of New York City. So he should definitely try to work with a lot of the city council people from this area and try to sort of win back the trust and support of that community. Other areas where Zohran did poorly, obviously we have South Staten Island. This is no surprise. This is a Republican area all the way down. The only surprise here is that Sliwa didn't win it, like I said. Andrew Cuomo was clearly very able to whip votes here among local Republicans and get them to sort of hold their nose and vote for him, even though he's sort of a part of the Democratic machine. So very interesting trend down there. We also see Zohran did very poorly on the Upper East Side of New York. This is not a surprise either. There are a lot of 1%ers here. It's a very rich neighborhood, very wealthy neighborhood. Zohran's tax plans probably did not endear them to him, and while this is a very Democratic neighborhood, it is no surprise that Zohran lost it in both the primary and the general. The other neighborhoods that he did poorly in include areas like Borough Park and Midwood. That's this stretch over here. And while this is very alarmingly dark purple, this was always kind of an expected loss among the campaign. This area is majority Orthodox Jewish, and a lot of those voters were uncomfortable with both Zohran's stances on Israel as well as Zohran's stances on sort of social matters which are drastically at odds with this community. This community usually elects very centrist Democrats, and they usually sort of vote as a bloc. A lot of voters from this area practice bloc voting with other members of the Orthodox Jewish community in order to sort of make sure that they are not undercounted and forgotten about in local politics. So Zohran Mamdani ultimately just did not get the endorsement of a lot of rabbis from this area because he is a progressive and because he has a very strong stance on the Israel-Palestine conflict that sort of is in opposition to the majority position in that area, and so I'm not at all surprised that he didn't win this area. We also have the sort of Brighton Beach, Sheepshead Bay neighborhood over here, which Zohran lost. He actually won this area during the primary, but honestly, I never expected it to go to him in the general. This area is very, very Russian. There are a lot of Russian people there, and while the primary electorate of sort of younger Russian people may have been pretty progressive, this area generally tends Republican. It has a Republican city council person, Ina Vernikov, so not at all surprised that Zohran did not do well there. A lot of Russian people have a very particular idea of socialism and how it was practiced in the USSR. Whether or not it's democratic socialism or authoritarian communism, they have sort of made up their minds about that fact, and I'm not surprised that they ultimately voted for Andrew Cuomo. We also see, of course, these areas out here, Rockaway, which is a very Republican area, similar story to Staten Island. I'm sure a lot of people here wanted to vote for Sliwa, but were just kind of holding their breath to vote for Cuomo to defeat Zohran because they recognized that Cuomo had the best opportunity to win over Zohran and was polling in second, and Curtis Sliwa was in a distant third. So same thing with Broad Channel, which is over here. It's this sort of island community, as well as this sort of area of Ozone Park and sort of the racetrack neighborhood over here and the Aqueduct neighborhood. Not at all surprised that these areas went to Cuomo. The only other areas that I can truly say that I can express any kind of surprise about, I would say are these areas over here down by Gravesend. These typically have very moderate Democrat representatives, but like Flushing, I kind of thought that a lot of the key endorsements from the Asian American community, this also has sort of a miniature Chinatown area located within it, and I thought that a lot of endorsements from the Asian American community and from Asian American civil society groups would push Zohran over the edge in this area. Unfortunately, it does not seem like it did that in this sort of, Bathurst, Gravesend, Diker Heights kind of area. So I hope that Zohran can sort of recoup his lead there in time for the next mayoral election come 2029. Other areas, of course, we have Throg's Neck up here. This is also a very moderate area. This area surprises me a little bit because they recently elected a very progressive city council person known as Shirley Aldable, who is very strongly pro-housing. I'm also surprised by sort of the Co-op City neighborhood over here, which, although it seems to have majority gone for Cuomo potentially, no, it did go for Zohran at the end of the day, but it didn't go for Zohran by as much as I was expecting. This is the area that produced Jamal Bowman, so I'm very, very surprised that Zohran Mamdani did not do better there as a fellow progressive. But yeah, this area just elected Shirley Aldable, who's a very progressive city council person, so I'm surprised it didn't go more towards Zohran, although this area does have a lot of very rich white areas. So this area as well, I'm not surprised by. This area is known as the Riverdale area of New York City. This area is represented by a lot of moderate Democrats, including one in the state assembly, Assemblyman Dinowitz, I believe, who was very, very opposed to Zohran's candidacy. So I'm not at all surprised that this area also went for Cuomo. So yeah, that is the state of the election. When we zoom out, I would also like to talk about, a few things that we see sort of just on the whole as sort of a broader trend. As I mentioned earlier, there were a lot of concerns from people who live in the outer boroughs, particularly in working class Black and Hispanic neighborhoods of Queens, of Brooklyn, and of the Bronx, that Zohran Mamdani would kind of be a gentrifier candidate, and that was used by the Cuomo campaign to a kind of cynical effect. They portrayed Zohran as a candidate who was only for people from Williamsburg who, shopped at Trader Joe's and, were hippies and smoked weed and all the rest, and were sort of, unbothered by the real problems that were affecting the city. But it does seem like that Zohran has kind of defeated this argument, and the ultimate answer to this argument is the fact that Zohran Mamdani did actually win these non-gentrified areas of the city. He ultimately did win East New York and Brownsville and Cambria Heights and the South Bronx, and that sort of is the strongest answer you can come up with to the fact that someone is accusing Zohran of being a gentrifier candidate, is that at the end of the day he won these areas, and that is the strongest rebuke possible of that argument. I would like to see Zohran not take these areas for granted and continue to work with those communities, especially since they didn't go to him by all that much. You can see a lot of these areas went to him by, potentially even a little less than 50%, with the other two candidates splitting the vote, or maybe just over 50%. So he can't take his lead here for granted, and especially if he does not do a good job as mayor, this will be the first place that any primary challenger would go to drum up support against him. So it will be very important to continue to engage with these communities, but it does go to show that at the end of the day, Zohran was able to win them. He won the argument in those areas. So that is the final map of the 2025 New York City mayoral election, and that is a detailed breakdown of where Zohran did well, where he underperformed, where he overperformed, and where he should focus on in the future. So now that that's out of the way, I would like to go over, to conclude this video, 5 lessons that I feel like any politician could take away from the Zohran Mamdani campaign and from the Andrew Cuomo campaign going into the 2026 midterms and beyond. The first lesson here is opposition research is not everything. Andrew Cuomo, whenever he was asked about his policy platform, would always go back and attack Zohran. He would never focus on his own campaign policies and promises, and would always bring it back to why Zohran is inexperienced and is not fit to be mayor and doesn't have enough on his resume or is too radical or so on and so forth. And that is why Andrew Cuomo lost, because all he had was opposition research. All he had was things to throw at Mamdani and never anything to say about his own record or what he planned to do as mayor. Zohran had a plan. And it might have been tempting for Zohran to do the same thing. Andrew Cuomo was an atrocious candidate who was accused of, sexual harassment a bunch of times. I'm sure it was tempting for Zohran to just say, really, this is your guy, Andrew Cuomo, the accused, sexual harasser, former governor. So I'm sure it was tempting for Zohran to do the same thing as well. But what Zohran really did is he locked down his policies. He had a very, very clear campaign message that he, kept on from the very beginning. He had a very clear vision for the city. He also did attack Andrew Cuomo's record, of course, and the fact that he was accused of all of these things, but he also stayed on message. He also had a message of his own to bring to the table. Zohran didn't just give you a reason to vote against Andrew Cuomo. He gave you a reason to vote for him. And that is what more politicians need in this day and age. In 2016 and 2020, we had 2 presidential candidates who were Democrats, Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton, and all they did was give you reasons to vote against Donald Trump and never a reason to vote for them. All they talked about is what Trump would do when he came to office. And to their credit, Trump has a lot of reasons to dislike him. He's a terrible candidate, and at the end of the day, he said a lot of really awful things. And in my opinion, he deserved to lose regardless of who the Democratic nominee is. And in one of those elections, which I had a chance to vote in, the 2024 election, I did wind up voting for Kamala Harris. At the end of the day, Donald Trump was disqualifying. But the fact of the matter is that, as much as, my progressive heart thinks that, a majority of voters don't. A majority of voters need a reason to vote for you, not just a reason to vote against the other guy. So politicians need to learn that going forward, especially from the Democratic Party. The second thing is to have a actually understandable policy platform. Zohran Mamdani did not produce, these lengthy documents explaining how he would make the city more affordable. He boiled it down to essentially, 4 to 5 very simple promises that all of his volunteers had memorized and that everyone can basically recite from heart who's been paying attention. Freeze the rent, fast and free buses, city-owned grocery stores, 200,000 new units of affordable housing, Department of Community Safety. Keep it simple, stupid. He kept his policies very simple, very easy for the average person to understand, and it was very easy to see how those policies could benefit your own life. Andrew Cuomo, on the other hand, had these really lengthy policy documents that were laying out his entire plan. He gave these very, very long-winded response on the rare occasion that he did address his own policy and not why just Zohran's policies couldn't work. He was accused early on in the race of using ChatGPT to write some of the policy documents that appeared on his website. So very clearly here, Zohran's policies were simple to understand. Cuomo's were not as simple to understand. Cuomo didn't have the catchy slogans. He didn't have the TikTok breakdowns of why his policies would work. And he just didn't have the sauce in explaining his policy platform to the people. The third thing is never give up on a community. That's the third lesson here. Andrew Cuomo and Zohran Mamdani were both challenged by 2 major communities in New York City political life. Andrew Cuomo was accused of Islamophobia by the Muslim community of New York City, or at least prominent members of it. Of course, I can't speak for either of these communities because I'm not a part of either of them. And Zohran Mamdani was accused by some major Jewish leaders of anti-Semitism. And the way these 2 leaders sort of reacted to those accusations was very different, in my opinion. Andrew Cuomo was very, very, sort of slow to denounce any kind of Islamophobia coming from his campaign. He never really engaged with the Muslim community. He hardly ever visited the Muslim community for any reason, and he just really didn't engage with the community that much. And as the race went on, Andrew Cuomo even started leaning into some of the Islamophobia. We saw this when on November 2nd or 3rd, I believe, he was on a podcast, and the podcast host made a joke about Zohran celebrating 9/11 because Zohran was a Muslim, and Andrew Cuomo went, well, yeah, that's another thing, which, implying that he agreed with that podcaster. So Andrew Cuomo really sort of leaned into the Islamophobia, made no effort to distance himself from it. And not only that, but Andrew Cuomo didn't really make an effort to appear in the Muslim community. He wasn't really at their community events. I think he visited like 1 or 2 mosques on the campaign, but that was about it. He never really made a major effort to appeal to the Muslim community. Whereas Zohran Mamdani, when he was accused of the Jewish community of prejudice towards that community, he actually put himself out there in that community. He went to the events. He met with the rabbis. He was in the temples and the synagogues. He was there, physically present in the community, shaking hands and kissing babies, even when he knew the answer from that community, as we can see, in areas like South Williamsburg, was in a lot of cases, no. He still made an appearance in those communities, and he still showed up. And at the end of the day, that is why I am willing to bet my bottom dollar that Andrew Cuomo won way fewer Muslim New Yorker voters than Zohran Mamdani won Jewish New Yorker voters. I am willing to bet that way more Jewish people voted for Zohran Mamdani than Muslims did for Andrew Cuomo. And I think that just boils down to the fact that Zohran Mamdani put himself out there. He made efforts to tie himself to key Jewish lawmakers such as, Brad Lander, Lincoln Ressler, so on and so forth. Whereas, I can't think of a single Muslim lawmaker that endorsed Andrew Cuomo. So that's the third lesson. Never give up on a community. Never turn your back on a community, no matter how much you think that community might hate or despise you or oppose you in any kind of way. You have to show up. You have to make a physical appearance in that community every time. Even if the entire community does not reward you, as we saw, in Borough Park in Williamsburg, you will get a few votes. And, a significant number of Jewish New Yorkers did vote for Zohran. And even if you won't win the entire community, you will still get some supplementary support from some members of that community. So never turn your back on any demographic, no matter how much you think that demographic might oppose you. The fourth thing to take away from this is never appear entitled. Andrew Cuomo appeared very entitled to this race. He thought that he was entitled to the mayorship, and I say that as someone who experienced his campaign ads, who experienced, the sort of Cuomo campaign proselytizing to me. I very much saw that it did seem like Andrew Cuomo kind of felt like he was entitled to this race. He constantly brought up his father's legacy. He constantly brought up the legacy of his family in politics. He constantly talked about, the fact that he has an incredibly extensive amount of experience in governance and Zohran had none. He very clearly felt as though he deserved this more than Zohran did. And the fact that he thought that he felt that he deserved your vote, that he deserved your support, really acted against him, I think. And this was even worse in the primary election. In the primary election, Andrew Cuomo ran an extremely lazy campaign, only making appearances at, very friendly forums to himself. He never went to any of the mayoral forums with all the other candidates before the debates. He only went to the debates which he was legally required to be at. And at the end of the day, voters responded. Voters can sense when you're entitled, and you should never, ever let yourself appear entitled because they will punish you for it if you do. The fifth and final lesson, which I think is the most obvious, is social media. You have to be on it these days. You have to have a presence on social media. And I'm not just talking about, Facebook and Twitter. You have to be present on places like TikTok and Instagram Reels where young people will see you. Zohran Mamdani was very savvy with this. He very clearly was on internet spaces where he knew that young people would be. He was very clearly in these online spaces explaining to young people what his policies were. And Andrew Cuomo really wasn't. He had a few, X accounts that were spreading, information on his behalf, but X/Twitter, that sort of, the average age of that user is much older than the average age of a TikTok or Instagram Reels user, and as a result, he didn't really reach young people. You have to have a presence on social media if you want to be a politician in this day and age. You just have to. So those are the 5 lessons that I feel like made the difference between the Zohran campaign and the Cuomo campaign. Number 1, you had a simple and easy to understand platform on behalf of Zohran Mamdani, whereas Cuomo did not have one. Number 2, Zohran Mamdani did not just rely on opposition research. He didn't just give voters a reason to vote against Cuomo. He gave voters a reason to vote for him. Number 3, Zohran didn't abandon any communities, no matter how much he believed that he would not win their votes or support. Number 4, Zohran did not let voters feel as though he was entitled to their vote. And number 5, Zohran had a presence in social media. Those 5 things are lessons that any politician should take away from the Zohran Mamdani campaign, and that National Democrats really have to learn in time for the midterms in 2026. And with that, I'm going to end this episode. Thank you for watching episode 1 of MamdaniWatch. I really appreciate you staying till the end of the video. Liking and subscribing would be very helpful to this channel. I would very much appreciate it. And I know there's a ton to talk about with regards to Mamdani's transition team, and we will be talking about that in a future episode whenever I decide to upload next. But for right now, I really just wanted to focus on the map and sort of, revel in the victory a little bit of Zohran Mamdani. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.